I think a ketogenic diet like you and I've talked about before for the right type of person is a great program, but it doesn't mean it fits everybody. Like for example, let's start with that. Who do you think the ideal candidate for a ketogenic diet is, and who is it not for?
In my practice, okay, I will recommend a ketogenic diet very rarely. The people that I think should be on a ketogenic diet are the people that are just, let's say, grade 2 obesity and beyond potentially. So in other words, if somebody comes to me, a male, and say they weigh, say they are, they're 5'8" and they're 350, 400 pounds, you better do something.
So their number one priority above all else is just losing body fat. They're not concerned about anything else.
That's correct.
So it's a fit for that person. Who's it not a fit for?
The people that would be placed on a ketogenic diet in my practice would be placed on it transiently. In other words, ultimately we would go to a modified ketogenic diet to create
so you do it short term to get some initial results and then transition them to a modified diet.
I would definitely use it in them transiently. Who is it not for? Well, I'm going to tell you. Basically everybody else in my practice is put on a modified ketogenic diet, which is we use daily carbohydrate loads, and depending upon the individual, somewhere between 50 and 100 grams of low glycemic index carbohydrates. So it's glycemic load low also. It's GI low, GL load, glycemic load or GL low as well.
Which we'll talk about today.
Fine.
So you're going to put them on a modified ketogenic diet, which means you're not taking them to, 30 or 40 grams and below.
Right.
We're going up as high as 100 grams, but we're doing low glycemic carbohydrates. And so that brings me to the next topic, which is obviously blood sugar levels and insulin. So let's talk about that. So help people understand why low glycemic carbs are important.
Right. So low glycemic index carbohydrates are important because, and we had alluded to this before, for a variety of reasons. Number one, blood sugars are not going to spike when you're using a low glycemic index carbohydrate. But almost more importantly, your insulin levels aren't going to go through the roof. Insulin, as we said, is a growth factor. So in addition to growing fat and muscle, but as you know, there's a predominance of fat, of our amassing fat, in this country because of the high consumption of high glycemic index carbohydrates and the caloric surplus. That's all under the influence of insulin.
So from a layman's perspective, my perspective, I've always looked at insulin, the way that it acts on different parts of the body. So let's keep it specific to muscle and to fat.
Right.
On skeletal muscle, it's signaling the body to go ahead and take those carbohydrates that are now glucose, store them as glycogen in the muscle.
Yep.
It's also signaling the muscle to use glucose as a source of fuel, to burn that as a source of energy. And then acting on fat, it's telling our body to store calories as fat.
Correct.
And it's also inhibiting lipolysis or the breakdown of fat. So high insulin levels really is the enemy of fat loss because it's telling our body to store more fat and telling us not to burn fat, correct?
Correct. It literally, the way I explain it to my patients in the office is there is a switch, okay, and it's insulin. If your insulin is on, your fat burning stops, you are amassing fat. If insulin is off, if insulin is low, okay, that is a signal to the body that it is in a, depending upon the duration, but it's just, let's say, it's in a starved state. So it's calling upon, like you said, the energy stores of the body, fat.
Right. From let's call it a low carb diet. Doesn't mean a ketogenic diet, it just means I've dropped my carbohydrates low. And if we're on this spectrum here, and then on the far side over here is a deep state of keto, and this is a fat loss spectrum here based on our carbohydrates, I would tell you that in the past, following a bodybuilding regimen, trying to get ready for a competition or a photo shoot, trying to shed body fat, I've always had to go low carb. And for the same reason we talked about, we got to bring our insulin levels down to allow our body to burn fat as a source of fuel. But with that being said, I'll draw this line here and say this is that line into ketosis. So this is, let's say, a deep state of ketosis, and this is maybe a lower level of keto. Right at this line, I always stopped right here. And this is, say, even in a carb cycling routine, that's why I always stopped at like 3 days, maybe 4 days max into a carb deplete, because I knew past 3 or 4 days I was going to hit ketosis.
Yep.
And then I was going to start losing more muscle than I wanted to lose. And that's the downside that you and I've talked about with the keto diet,
Sure.
is that once you hit ketosis, it's easy for your body to start breaking down muscle as a source of fuel. And I never wanted to do that, because my goal over here was maintain lean muscle
Yep.
and lose body fat. But with that being said, this still worked. So in this zone right here, I was still able to shed a tremendous amount of body fat. I guess my point would be that without hitting a state of ketosis, I'm able to burn fat, and that's because
Absolutely.
I'm managing my insulin levels.
100%. The ideal sort of situation there, and like you said, and I don't know where your threshold was where, okay, I'm in ketosis, I better stop 4 days in, I better stop, or I better add a little bit more carbohydrate. I don't know exactly what you did.
That's where I actually use keto strips.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you use the sticks?
I use
the
them
strips?
not to say, hey, I'm trying to get into ketosis. I use it as a marker to say, okay, I'm starting to creep into ketosis,
Right.
and that's when I would stop.
And that I think is a very, very sort of a rudimentary way to do it, as opposed to playing around with blood ketones. I mean, you just don't need to do that. The blood ketones are, I guess, useful for individuals that, as I had said before, are on a full ketogenic diet and want to max out the speed at which they are losing body fat. But my patients that are grade 2 obesity, grade 3 obesity, whatever, and worse, but at what cost? See, the thing about it is that what you don't want to do is, when you are deep into ketosis, 3 millimolar, 4 millimolar, you're there. What you also want to do is, in addition to burning fat, you also want to spare as much muscle as possible, because then you're otherwise you're going to lose your engine. And this is despite the fact that they say that, oh, the ketones, they're muscle sparing. You and I both know a lot of people who've been on ketogenic diets. Okay,
They're not that muscle sparing.
They're not.
No. I mean, look, and I get it. And I hear people talk about it on the forums, and they get in an uproar over it. But from practical experience, when you're trying to maintain real lean muscle, it just doesn't happen. So that's what I want to hone in on this conversation is, so with your patients, you'll do a modified ketogenic diet, but I think there's even a spectrum there of, let's call it instead of a low carb diet, so this conversation would be, let's call it low carb versus low glycemic. Because from my perspective, low glycemic doesn't mean low carb at all.
No.
I could consume 200 grams, 300, 400 grams of carbs a day and have them all be low glycemic.
Yep.
So it's certainly not low carb. So the conversation is, low carb versus low glycemic, but let's start on one end of the spectrum, because I think where you're taking your patients when you go from a true ketogenic diet into a modified ketogenic diet is still a combination of maybe not low, it's lower carb plus low glycemic, right?
That's right. So basically, James, if you were to sort of sum that up, that which you just wrote there, it's basically a low glycemic load protocol.
Right.
That's what it is.
So let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people probably have questions. What the difference between GI, the glycemic index, versus GL, which is glycemic load. From my perspective, so correct me if I'm wrong, glycemic load is the quality of the carbohydrates factoring in the quantity of carbohydrates.
That's right. So it's GI times the amount of carbohydrates per serving divided by 100. That's going to be your glycemic load. Okay?
So let's take something that's considered low glycemic by your standard, because I know they typically categorize low glycemic as 55 and under. You say it's more like 45 and under.
I use 40, yeah. I mean,
Okay,
I'm aggressive, because I know that there is going to be, humans are humans, and there's going to be an error rate. You know what I'm talking about.
So I got a list here that Andrea printed up of some different low glycemic. So we'll take one as an example. So let's say, we'll just use brown rice as an example. So brown rice people consider low glycemic, which is an interesting conversation.
It's not, but okay. It's not.
It's almost.
Yeah.
If it's 45.
Right. No, I think it's more than that. I think it's in the 50s, right?
I think here's where the interesting argument. I think that it's low glycemic, but it's definitely not low on the glycemic load. And so, like, if we were to do the math, so if it's 45 on the glycemic index, and then, like you said, we multiply that by the serving. So let's say that a half a cup has roughly 50 grams of carbs.
Right.
Right?
So whatever it is, it's 2,000
What is-
2,000 divided by 100.
What was
Okay.
it roughly? I don't have it.
Whatever it is.
2,400 or something?
Yeah,
like
something like that. Whatever.
Okay,
it is.
let's just forgive
Yeah.
our bad math.
It doesn't
All right,
matter.
I don't have, so let's say it's 2,400
divided by 100.
divided by 100.
Yeah.
So we get 24.
Right.
Now on the glycemic load, the scale it's under 10 is considered low.
Right.
11 to 19 is medium.
Yep.
And then 20 plus is high. So
Right.
even though brown rice is considered low glycemic, when we look at only a half a cup, which is nothing, because I know a lot of people that eat more than a cup, it's falling high on the glycemic load.
Right. This is why I tell people no. I don't even talk to them about glycemic load. Why? Because people get confused.
Right.
I just tell them GI, all right, and that's it, and I just rough it.
Well, and I think that's the one challenge though, is because then people go back and they question. They say, yeah, but it's got fiber in there and it's considered low on the glycemic index. Why can't I have it? And this is why you can't have it if you're in a lower carb, lower glycemic diet.
Right. And when people come and they say that they eat rice all the time and they're having problems losing weight, but I thought rice was a good. No, I eliminate fruits. I mean, you know what my protocol is like. I mean, on the first couple of weeks, I allow them to have some blueberries and strawberries and things like that. As you know, their glycemic indices of those are around 40. But thereafter, I start cutting them back. I want to get rid of that addiction to sweets. It's the same reason why I tell people don't use artificial sweeteners, because that has been proven not to do anything as far as fat loss is concerned, because you're not training your brain to crave, or to not crave that sweet.
So would you say that it's fair? So in a protocol where you're taking your clients who are trying to lose weight, by the way, so they're coming to a doctor and saying, I want to lose fat.
Yep.
So on a scale of over here where this is, let's say, your actual ketogenic people, then you transition them over into, let's call it this, low carb protocol, or I'll use your term, a modified ketogenic diet. So on this scale here, maybe all the way over to something on this line where we're saying, hey, this is a guy who cares about muscle building. So this is someone who still really just care about fat loss.
Right.
At this point. Most of them aren't saying, hey, I want to maintain lean muscle, or I want to build muscle and I still want to be lean.
Right.
But what about this guy who says, I want to build muscle, right? I'm reading Muscle and Fitness magazine. I want to look like that, but I still want to be lean. I'd say that there's a pretty broad spectrum here.
Yep.
And so that's kind of what I want to explore, because going back to this, to low glycemic, we're using brown rice as an example.
Right.
We know that it doesn't fit this protocol because it's certainly not low on the glycemic load.
Right.
But we also know to build muscle, carbohydrates play a part. And actually, I would love to have you talk about that. So we've already talked about what's required to lose fat, which is managing our insulin levels, keeping our blood sugars low, keeping insulin levels low, and that's going to help us trigger fat loss. But on this side, what's required really to build muscle?